Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in ENO's latest webinar. I'm Brianne Eby, a Senior Policy Analyst at ENO, and today I'm looking forward to a panel discussion about congestion pricing's role in building more equitable transportation systems. In May of this year, ENO released a report titled Congestion Pricing in the United States, Principles for Developing a Viable Program to Advance Sustainability and Equity Goals. In that report, we describe how congestion pricing has been pursued for a number of years in international cities as a tool to manage roadway demand. The basic idea of the policy is to charge a fee for the parts of the roadway used most during the busiest times of day, which can help to reduce the negative effects of traffic like air pollution, carbon emissions, roadway damage, and crashes. While there may be temptation to use any revenue that's generated from a congestion pricing program to shore up general funds, especially in today's context where transit agencies and DOTs are taking a financial hit, a more equitable approach would be to allocate revenues toward community priorities like the expansion of multimodal options rather than the maintenance of a system that favors single occupancy vehicles. In our report, we discuss how one principle of congestion pricing should be to create fair programs, which essentially boils down to, number one, using deliberate data analysis to assess how the baseline transportation system affects vulnerable populations and how they will be affected by a future congestion pricing program. Number two, building inclusion into the process of developing a congestion pricing strategy. And number three, creating a policy that is itself equitable. And today we have three panelists to discuss these various aspects. The first is Rio Oshas from RAHOK, Race, Ancestors, Health, Outdoors, and Knowledge, which is a family-owned social enterprise that provides services in education, land stewardship, and asset management. Hana Creger is the Environmental Equity Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute, and she works on the development and implementation of policies leading to clean transportation and mobility investments that will benefit low-income communities of color. And finally, Tilly Ting is the Executive Director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, which plans, funds, and delivers local and regional transportation prices to people from San Francisco.
Madam Secretary,
Just
sure, and I did want to note, it looks like one member of the public just jumped right back.
Sorry, a little bit of feedback there. Tilly, if you're able to put yourself on mute, that would help. Just a quick administrative note. So our speakers will be presenting back to back for roughly 25 minutes total, and you can submit questions at any time using the questions function through the webinar. We'll then go to about 20 minutes of Q&A, and you can of course submit questions at that point as well. We'll try to hit as many of the questions as we can, and just so you know, today's slides will be available after the fact on ENO's website. And with that, I will turn it over to Rio.
Hey everybody, my name again is Rio Oshas. I use they, them, their pronouns. I am with RAHOK. I just co-founded that recently. And today's focus is that I really wanted to take literally a bird's eye view around congestion, but looking at things from a standpoint of historical things that have led to the highway building. So I guess my little subject matters will be congestion, COVID-19, and Black Lives Matter, which are not very little. They're actually really huge. But these are important things we have to think about in relationship to how our world's being developed and what equity looks like now for the long haul, given that the pandemic has really highlighted some of these inequities in a very intense way. And oh, I forgot to say, and very important to say, is that I want to acknowledge that I'm in Tongvalands here in Los Angeles. Okay, next slide. So the first thing I want to point out to is the incredible work by the Buffalo Soldiers, the Iron Riders. This is the during the 1896 excursion from Fort Missoula to Yellowstone Park. It was the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps. And this particular group is very important to note because one, they were all Black men who were in this infantry, and they were used, actually, these bikes were actually used to literally pave roads through a lot of what now have been major highways throughout the United States, right? And so I think one of the things that this group, along with others, was the Good Roads movement, right? And so bikes really led on to the paving of the roads. And a lot of that came from the desire to expand, right? Expand westwardly, and also, unfortunately, colonize a lot of the lands, right? So these are very important pieces. So next slide. And this goes really in tandem with a lot of the work that a lot of this particular group called the American Indians and Route 66 have been doing in routing out some of that historical development of the highway that so Route 66 was this is a direct quote. Route 66 was an officially commissioned highway from 1926 to 1985. During its lifetime, the road guided travelers through the lands of more than 25 tribal nations. It was a give and take relationship between the asphalt and the American Indian people. From the physical intrusion of the road on the American Indian lands to the new commerce the road introduced, right? And so these are very important roles, right? We had our Buffalo soldiers who really helped the paving and really set that out. And then we have Route 66 being like kind of a symbolic moment that divided a lot of the country, particularly the tribal nations, and that allowed for the goods movement to move quickly, right? But it also devastated a lot of the communities, and the environment, right? So those are things that they're also talking about, is that it literally created havoc in the environment. So next slide. Another thing that is worth pointing out is also how highways have been strategically implemented into creating divisions amongst communities. So this mural here is by UCLA professor Judy Baca. If anybody doesn't know her, definitely check out her work. I grew up in Echo Park, which is right next to Chavez Ravine. I mean, it's in the same neighborhood. And a lot of the history that we understand was that highways, right? So you have the 110, the 101, and all that development. And the 110 was like the first freeway, right? So we have the highways being installed before, but we had the first freeway in Los Angeles called the 110, which is like a major area of congestion, right? Which is why this is an important conversation, was that it was also used to strategically divide communities. And what it ended up doing is now you had you'll see on the mural too, two territories. So you look at the faces of those families who were actually families now having this territorial life, right, around it. And the territorialness really has to do with the fight for the crumbles, right? The crumbs, as we say, right? And so these are very important things to, again, highlight in equity. Next slide. Another important historical group that we have to also mention is the transcontinental road that was developed, right? And a lot of the Chinese workers were brought over from China to pretty much be exploited labor, right? They were very exploited labor. And so this particular picture is denoting when the Chinese railroad workers went on strike because of how they were being exploited. And again, relating it to congestion, a lot of these major thoroughfares, this transcontinental rail was definitely focused on moving goods, which is good and concerning, right? Because we also have just the exploitation of the earth really quickly. But also it led to a lot of the different light rails, right? In the key lines that a lot of different neighborhoods had, right? So it had some positive things, but it came with some negative things. And it, for me, it's always important to honor the ancestors who really gave up their lives so that we can enjoy things like a train. So I wanted to take a pause for the Chinese rail workers. Next slide. And then in Los Angeles specifically, so now leading into those smaller trains, we had in the 1940s, Los Angeles had the world's most famous like commuter lines. I mean, people around the world came and saw the ways that the light rails were developed, and it was just incredible. And in this particular piece, actually, my friend and great artist Sandra de la Loza, definitely check out her work, started to make an homage to what she called To Oblivion, right? Because we had this last ride, and the train operator himself put To Oblivion in the front of the train, as it's like, hey, this is gonna be gone. Of course, now Metro Los Angeles has readapted a lot of those very same lines, right, in order to reduce congestion, right? And so it's kind of one of these interesting things where we keep going back and forth, and in the meantime, leaving families behind. Next slide. And some of the last things I want to mention is that, on the right-hand side, the graph that I have there is about the CO2 emissions, right? So I think for me, I know congestion for a lot of us, part of it is obviously being able to move freely, but it's also about reducing our emissions, right? And making our air better. And unfortunately, United States, who has only 4.5% of the world's population, contributes to 14% of the CO2 emissions. So that's kind of what this graph is showing. And within it, and if you look at to the left-hand side, within that 14%, 30% of it, almost 30% of it is related to transportation. So all of us on this call have such an important role in making sure that congestion is alleviated in a way that is effective. But to Brianne's point, I think a lot of the work we're going to have to do is to ensure that those resources, if we are going to tax, which I already have some qualms about quote unquote taxing or taking more money. But if we are, it has to be people who are being subsidized, which usually are suburb drivers or the wealthier folks. And it has to benefit those folks who are already during the pandemic risking their lives every day taking the bus. And I just was on a bus a couple weeks ago, and I can see literally people there who are on the bus have 3 jobs and are risking their lives still because they have no choice. So for us in this time of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, we really have to concentrate our efforts to address those issues that our Black Lives Matter movement and leaders are pushing for, and anybody who's really being hit hard by the pandemic, which is our Black relatives and a lot of our indigenous relatives, right? So next slide. And I think that that's kind of the piece I want to close off with. So definitely feel free to follow me or reach out to me at riooshas@rock.org, and you can check me out on my website too. Thank you all very much. I'll pass it on.
Great, thanks, Rio. We'll move on to Hana now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for putting on this webinar, and thank you, Rio, for providing that context. I'm Hana Creger. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am on Ohlone lands in Berkeley, California. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar, Greenlining is a research and public policy nonprofit that has been advocating for racial equity and economic justice for 27 years. And so with the racial equity lens, we work across a whole variety of policy areas, transportation being one of them, to greenline communities of color with investments, opportunities, and a better quality of life. Next slide. But we always have to start with the beginning, and we have to talk about why Greenlining and our partners even have to do this racial equity work. So redlining was one of many racist policies that contribute to the injustices we see today, but redlining specifically was the institutionalized and systematic practice of government working with realtors and banks to draw literal red lines around communities of color and deny them loans to buy homes or open businesses. So this is the redlining map of San Francisco. And so what do the colors actually mean on this map? Well, green equals best, blue means desirable, yellow indicates declining, and red indicates hazardous, signifying the level of risk of lending money to that part of the city. And the primary indicator of risk was race. Next slide, please. So redlining was instituted all over the US. Between 1932 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion worth of loans. More than 98% of those loans went to white families. And so this was a time when white Americans were amassing intergenerational wealth to buy homes, start businesses, and fund their children's education, while people of color were effectively locked out of those same opportunities. And even while this practice was technically outlawed decades ago, this lack of investment still has lingering impacts today. Next slide. Because redlining didn't just impact homeownership. As Rio explained, it forced people of color to live in polluted areas with poor transportation options and far from economic opportunities. And this is important because a Harvard study found that a person's commute time is the single greatest factor in their chances of escaping poverty, more than crime rates or school test scores. And so clearly, transportation is not just about moving people from A to B. It's really about moving people up the economic ladder and giving them a better quality of life. And so we can't talk about transportation equity without also talking about economic equity. Next slide. And so I'd like to share Greenlining's perspective on equity. I'm sure most of us know that equity is not the same thing as equality, but I really want to expand on that point further, because equity is not just about fair access either, although a very important point. And I like that this image kind of digs deeper and shows that a bit more. So equality means that everyone is treated with the same one-size-fits-all solution. But equity means that solutions are tailored to meet the various needs of different groups. And from our perspective, equity is also very much focused on the process of what it takes to get there to those tailored solutions. So equity is really about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm oppressed groups of people, whether that's low-income folks, people of color, women, LGBTQ folks, the elderly, and people with disabilities. And equity is really about increasing access to power. It's about redistributing and providing additional resources, eliminating barriers to opportunity, and empowering marginalized communities to thrive and reach their full potential. And so thinking about equity in this kind of power building and ownership perspective, that's the context in which we discuss congestion pricing and how we talk about our mobility equity framework. Next slide. So I'll start by outlining the problems that this framework aims to solve. First, we know low-income folks of color suffer disproportionately from transportation injustices. Second, these communities have often been not given the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the transportation planning and decision-making process, and in many cases have been purposefully shut out. And finally, there's just so many new mobility options today. Uber, bike share, scooter share, but there's not really a good way for communities to determine for themselves which are the most equitable and which best meet their needs, especially when we compare them to more traditional modes like walking, biking, and transit. And so this is why we developed this framework as an equitable decision-making tool to figure out which mobility options best meet community needs. But for the purposes of this congestion pricing conversation and context, we can think about this process as a tool to help decide which congestion pricing policy approaches are the most equitable and how to empower folks to select the strategies that best meet community needs. Next slide. These are the three goals of the framework: to create a transportation system that not only improves access to high quality mobility options, but it also reduces air pollution and congestion and enhances economic opportunities for low-income folks of color all at the same time. Because as I said before, equity is about so much more than just access. We really have to be addressing all of the interconnected issues that marginalized folks face. And so right now I'll walk you through the 3 steps of the framework using the example of District 10 in San Francisco that has implemented the framework. Next slide. So step 1, of course, must begin with the community identifying their most pressing mobility needs. But that doesn't just mean like sending out a survey and calling it a day, right? You really have to give folks an equitable platform to propose potential mobility solutions that meet their needs. And so in San Francisco, they partnered with community leaders to understand how do you even make this process more accessible and more relevant to the needs of those residents. And so the results of the initial workshop were 150 residents who were paid to brainstorm and co-design over 90 ideas to make transportation more equitable in their community. Because they are the experts in their communities and in what they need, and therefore they should be paid as such. Next slide. So step 2 is an equity analysis, to then take what they've brainstormed and then assess and compare the equity outcomes of the various mobility project proposals. Now, I just got to say this up front, there is no such thing as a standard cookie cutter equity analysis. The community has to be deeply involved in selecting the appropriate equity indicators and metrics that reflect their needs in order to evaluate the proposals. And so as a starting point, we have these 12 equity indicators listed here, categorized under the 3 overarching goals of the framework. And in San Francisco, the 90 project ideas were put through an equity analysis that represented their needs. And so, even though this equity analysis was designed to assess and compare different mobility options, this could easily be retooled to assess and compare various congestion pricing policies and strategies based on equity indicators that reflect the community values and priorities. Next slide. So the last step in the process is the community having a final say on which mobility services or policies to fund and deploy. And so through a democratic vote, the community decided to implement 10 equitable mobility options to meet their needs, which included ideas such as a community shuttle. And so again, in this context, residents or a community advisory committee could vote on which congestion pricing strategies to implement. Next slide. So just to quickly review, this is a very customizable process to help determine which mobility modes or policies are the most equitable for your community and geographic context, which best reflects the needs and the values of that community, and most importantly, how to place that decision-making power in the hands of the community. And so in addition to being implemented in San Francisco, the framework has also been adapted to the Seattle region, to a ride-sharing pilot, to transit agencies developing equity tools, and to a few state of California grant programs. And so the point is, this framework is flexible and adaptable as a tool to prioritize equity and community engagement across many different forms of transportation planning and decision making, and has now been adapted to the congestion pricing context. Next slide. So thank you so much. Feel free to reach out, and looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Hana. And we'll move to Tilly Chang next.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Thank you, Eno, for hosting us, and to my co-panelists, Rio and Hana. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm happy to present on our downtown San Francisco congestion pricing study. My name is Tilly Chang. I serve as the Executive Director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. I also want to recognize in the audience our Assistant Deputy for Planning, Rachel Hyatt, who not only is leading this study together with our project manager, Colin Dental Post, but she also led some of the prior work that Hana talked about in District 10 in San Francisco, the Bayview. Next slide, please. So this study has its roots from many, many years ago, but our board has asked us to update a prior study that we had conducted in 2010 because of the congested conditions that we had experienced. Of course, that was prior to the recent pandemic, which has dramatically, of course, changed all of our lives, including reducing congestion in much of the downtown core. However, some of that has returned, and in many places, not just in San Francisco, particularly near freeways and bridges, that traffic level is even returning to higher than pre-COVID levels. Next slide, please. So the next slide shows that what it had been in 2019, and it's not anywhere as severe as this now. I mean, there is lower levels of traffic today, but near the bridges again, and in some parts of the freeway network, we do see, again, higher levels than even pre-COVID. So next slide, please. What we have been doing about this is really documenting the impacts, because I think it's really important for everyone to understand it's not just, for peak period, downtown-oriented commuters that we're concerned about here. We're concerned about what the congestion means for folks who are living in the neighborhood. There are hundreds and hundreds of families in our downtown core. It is our also concentration of high injury network for the Vision Zero network, and this is a safety initiative that we have been leading in San Francisco, and it's nationwide and worldwide here for traffic safety. And our communities of concern are designated in purple, and that shows lower income and minority communities and those with less car ownership. So we know that congestion disproportionately affects low income and racial minorities and those with disabilities, those who are in transit in particular, who are on buses and have to contend with traffic and conflicts, safety and collisions and severe injuries and fatalities that occur on the network, and as well as the airshed, right? That, of course, is the exposure to all the traffic in these neighborhoods. In some of these south of Market neighborhoods, you have traffic that is 70% pass-through. So they're not even destined to these neighborhoods, and yet they bear the daily impact of the traffic. Next slide. Understanding the context is important, as well as that we have been working on many, many other strategies. This is really the last tool in our toolbox. Our agency is the Congestion Management Agency for San Francisco. Our North Star is sustainable modes and development of dedicated bicycle and pedestrian and transit networks, and demand management, parking management, and land use, all of the above. It's really been a tremendous effort for 45 years and done a lot, but it's really not enough. And we have found that we do need to reach for that last tool in the toolbox, at least to explore it very seriously, and that is road pricing. Next, please. So this is just another snapshot of Market Street, which is our main boulevard downtown, which today is car-free. So I'm really proud of our sister agencies, SFMTA, Public Works, and the city for making that move. But even with things like more car-free streets, we are seeing still this very, very high level of traffic at least pre-COVID. Next, please. So our goal here is to reduce literally the number of cars traveling in this downtown area in peak periods. And we had documented through prior work that it's really everyone who commutes in here and who travels contributing to the problem. We know that it's a combination of even transportation network companies. There's 1 in 4 trips documented in the downtown peak in the area is a TNC. That was a work that we had done a couple of years ago, but it's also non-TNCs and just folks driving, and we'll talk a little bit about who those folks are in just a minute. So next slide, please. Congestion pricing has been discussed in San Francisco for many years, as I mentioned, since our 2010 study. At that time, that was a reaction to the first dot-com boom and sort of the economy accelerating. And then, of course, we went into recession. And since that time, we had another boom, which was led by the economic development of the downtown area. And now we know that, it's become much more of a proven strategy as identified and experienced in other parts of Asia, Europe, and other places, and now even New York and many West Coast and other cities in the US are exploring it. Next. So many policies and plans have looked to this strategy, and our challenge, of course, is to move more people in fewer vehicles. It's quite simple, actually, and we kind of do different ways of educating the public. You can go to our website, sfcta.org/pricing, and you can find many resources there to document sort of what the nature of the problem is and how we're defining our goals. Next, please. Here we are. This is analysis of who it is that travels in the peak by car. And our downtown travel patterns are showing that in that northeast section in purple, about 75% of the folks driving in the peak are coming from within the city, which is very surprising to many people. They think, oh, it must be folks coming from the South Bay. As you may know, the East Bay and the North Bay, we have bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge and the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge to the east. Well, there are certainly some trips coming in on those routes as well, but the majority of peak period driving trips are coming from within San Francisco. And so we really know that this is critical information for us to know how to then provide for the alternative ways for those folks in the city to get around and to try and shift their either route or their mode or their travel time period. Next, please. But what's really important is who are these folks? They're just not a monolithic group, right? So what was important is to disaggregate this market of peak period drivers and travelers. And so what you see here is all of the travelers to downtown in the morning peak by income and by mode. So by income are the bars that you see from very low and low to moderate, middle, and high, from top to bottom. And then the colors designate the mode choice of these travelers, with red being automobile, private auto, sort of pink, ride hail, yellow, transit, on and off street, as well as walk and bike, so in blue. As you go across, you can see the distribution of trips by income and by mode, and this is really critical to understand that about 13% of our peak period travelers are low income, and if you're looking at the peak period driving mode, the red portions of the bar, that gets to be about 20%, 20 to 25. So it's really important for us to understand who are the folks traveling today, so that we understand what it is that we can solve for as far as impacts, as well as who benefits and who is impacted by a potential congestion pricing and mobility improvement project. Next. So our goals, as Hana mentioned, are really to understand the outcome equity as well as the process equity. And I'll talk a little bit first about the outcome equity goals. And this is something that the 35-member policy advisory committee that Hana serves on, I really appreciate your work there with us, Hana, and that she's presented to that group as well, is really guiding us in our work on the study. Next slide, please. So 15% is the goal of this group, and this was a determination that was an early action item that the Policy Advisory Committee voted on to endorse this 15% reduction in peak period car trips. Just very simply, we need to reduce the number of peak period car trips in our downtown to this level, we believe. Next. But by doing so, we can get traffic moving, and particularly buses. We really measure not only the travel time and reliability of private vehicles, but of buses. And folks in buses, of course, are predominantly lower income and have more vulnerability in general. So we want to make sure that we prioritize moving everyone, but particularly those folks in public transportation and biking and walking, ensuring we're reducing the conflicts, increasing their safety on the streets, cleaning our air, and advancing equity as well through those exposures. and also the choices that they can also, alternatives and choices that they have, improving mobility options for everyone in the area. Next, please. And so the advancing equity is, I'll just go ahead and next slide, please. Talk a little bit about how we're looking at doing that. That has in many ways to do with ensuring that the benefits accrue primarily to those who are most vulnerable or lower income travelers and commuters, and also ensuring that we have the right equity process in terms of developing the study and decision-making process, as Hannah mentioned earlier. Let's go ahead and see the next slide, please. The Policy Advisory Committee has been advising us for about 9 months, and we really appreciate their valuable time. They are the experts. They have great insight, not only to traditional data, but lived experience type of data, which absolutely brings that really important source of information to our process. Each of them has been a leader in their communities in many different ways, and so we have been really blessed with a fantastic group of advisors through the Policy Advisory Committee. And they meet about once every 6 weeks or so, and sometimes take deep dives on specific topics that they've indicated that they would like more information on. And I think, is that Hana presenting in the background? Thank you so much. Next. And so this group is also advising us on how we can engage communities throughout the city, and particularly in the project area. And this includes co-creation sessions, and these are sometimes, in language, with a host community-based organizations who we pay to help us to do this outreach, and as well the program participants, we also pay for their valuable time. And they are helping shape the goals, they're shaping the strategies, ensuring that we're looking at the appropriate discounts and exemptions, making the investments with program revenues in the right way, in the right places, and making sure that we are being accountable to our adopted goals, which include, making as many jobs available within a certain radius by transit or by car, which look at exposures to different impacts, as well as, of course, the traditional measures of travel time, reliability, and affordability. Next. So this is just an example of a game that we're playing at the moment, and this is sort of a co-creation tool to let folks decide how they want to weigh in on the program design and relating to discounts, transit improvements, and fee levels. Next. And as we have encountered the COVID challenges, adjusting our outreach was important. Ensuring that the COs, the PAC, the Policy Advisory Committee, had the capacity first was important, and that they believed in moving forward, which they did advise us to please go ahead and move forward, even though it's a tough time for many people in our community. But they think that it's important to be ready for when we are recovering, and that this is part of our recovery strategy as well, to ensure that we have advanced the study and are prepared in the event and when recovery does occur. Next. Finally, the engagement tools that we show here are many that are familiar to most studies and other places that have digital and non-digital means. We're trying to use SMS texting. We're trying to use different kinds of town hall formats and different radio and television, as well as traditional media. Next, I think this is our last slide coming right up, and that's publicity, to ensure that we have also low and no contact distribution and in language methods as well, and ensuring that we're engaging in our nonprofit community, as well as compensating them for that time and expertise. Next. So we're basically in the middle of our study, and next slide shows that we will be finishing in the fall with some analysis and recommendations in the winter and spring of 2021. Thank you so much, and happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. We've had a bunch of questions come in so far, so I'll try to kind of aggregate between some recurring themes that have been coming up, so we can try to touch on as much as possible in the few minutes we have left. So I'll go through and ask each of you a question individually, but if the others want to chime in, please do feel free. And I'll start with Rio. So I know you have a background in community engagement. Could you share some of the building blocks for building an inclusive policy planning process into policy design. One of the questions that came in was about building community trust of transportation planners. So what are some of the strategies that you've seen to make that happen?
Yeah, that's a very great question, especially because I know that often when I started to engage as an organizer with a lot of the more bureaucrats or transportation officials, I think a lot of community members start beginning to kind of have a distrust, right? And a lot of that is really stemmed from the fact that, you know, unfortunately, institutional forms of racism and the way that our government has set up systems of oppression have led to that, you know, very rightful distrust, right? And so often the ways that, well, one, if you're asking me as an organizer, how do I contend with that? It's that I know that I'm being a fisher sometimes in like a boulder, right? So if I think of this bureaucratic process as a kind of a boulder and I come in as a fisher and I kind of try to maybe shake it up that way, that's one of the ways that I think about it, and knowing that I am trying to be the most like honorable, best thing that I can, and that we need to be at the table, right? Like that's one thing, is our voices need to be heard. So I think there's that one level of community engagement. And then what's really happening now, and I think what Black Lives, and this is what the reason why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important to bring up right now, is a lot of what the Black Lives Matter movement is really helping us do is that now let's flip the script. Instead of us having to go to the table, have, you know, the bureaucrats, the people with the resources, the officials to come to our tables, right? And so I think a lot of the community engagement now, which before was us getting a seat at the table, is now about like, we have our seats, we've been having our tables, and now you really need to come to approach the community in a really thoughtful, humble way and a very compensatory way. I really am thankful that Hana and Tilly really pointed out that the communities were compensated for their expert knowledge, right? So I'll leave it at that, but that's definitely the most honorable way that we can do it at this time.
That's actually a great segue to my next question. A bunch of questions have come up on how exactly participants were compensated. So Hana and maybe Tilly as well, if you want to weigh in on that. But then also just speaking to the process of how voting works and how community participation works. How do you ensure representation also in voting? So somebody acknowledged that, you know, often the loudest voices are the ones that, you know, people that have the resources to be participating. So how do you ensure that the voting itself is equitable?
Feel free to Hana jump in, but I'll just mention that we do pay our program participants about $50, I believe, for their time in a co-creation session, which can run, you know, 60 to 90 minutes. The CBO also is provided compensation for their time to plan, host, and wrap up evaluation of the session. That could be somewhere between $500 to $1,000 per session. So we can connect folks to our team and get the details of that. As far as a great question about representation, so we first got a lot of input on just even developing the policy advisory committee structure itself. Input from the community, from recognized leaders and regional experts about who should be at the table. Then when we got them together, they actually defined their own sort of protocols, led by Reflex, our consultants, and trying to figure out, well, what am I saying when I vote in this way? There's like 4 different ways you can vote, showing your level of agreement, or if you're just kind of no objecting, or you kind of have concerns, but you're willing to go forward, or you really do have problems and you're raising a flag. So we have different, very interesting ways to express different opinions and to qualify your vote in some cases, so that we can see the degree of agreement or the degree of disagreement in the vote outcome.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that I think we have to be really intentional about, you know, who we are uplifting in terms of voting, and just. I think what's been interesting is that I would say the policy advisory committee in this case is a little bit more of like the grass tops advocacy organizations. And from my understanding, the community kind of groups who are paid to do this, as they should be, definitely are a bit more of a diverse representation of San Francisco. And so perhaps those kinds of votes should be weighted differently. And it's a kind of thing that, like, this is something that folks have never done before. It's totally iterative. Like, maybe next time around we'll realize that we do want to kind of like weigh those votes in a different way. So that's just one suggestion.
Great, and Hana, we'll stick with you. I also wanted to ask about building flexibility into the equity analysis process. So, in other words, how might equity indicators change as community priorities change? How do you, enable the process of analyzing this to be flexible?
Yeah, so, I showed on my slides, we have 12 equity indicators. And I just want to emphasize, like, that is really just the starting point. Like, the sky's the limit, right? Ideally, the community identifies additional equity indicators and metrics that aren't listed here, that we didn't think of, that are very specific to their community. We also recommend that they could assign weights to different various equity indicators depending on what seems most critical in the moment. And again, this is all back to really building community ownership over the process. But I think, the main takeaway, it really is about the process by which we arrive at selecting the appropriate equity indicators. And, not just related to the selection of them, but updating them as time goes on. And so, as we see potentially, demographic shifts, technological changes, these shifts absolutely really have to be factored in and reflected into how we conduct equity analyses of mobility options and priorities. And, even for example, the framework was published over 2 years ago, and we're already like, oh, wow, this is so out of date. Like, we have to include policing, displacement, climate adaptation, financial sustainability. So I just want to emphasize that conditions change very quickly, and so do equity indicators and analyses. But what has to remain constant is how communities are involved in shaping and influencing those decisions.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to tag a little piece on that, because I think that, and Hannah, you're spot on how to analyze that. But what I have seen is people get flexible, a little bit confused, right? And they get flexible as in making compromises. And I know that for me, at least during this pandemic, and again during this Black Lives Matter movement, it's no longer about being flexible to make compromises because another wealthier community wanted something. It's about flexibility in really meeting the needs of the folks who are most marginalized, right? And I like that idea about weighing people, because you have a lot of folks who are at intersections, right? They could be undocumented, they could be trans, they could be really poor, they could be uneducated, they could have a disability, right? All these things actually add up to making your life outcomes that much more difficult, even to move around a city, right? Like, that actually prevents you from moving in a more like equitable, just way. So I just wanted to piggyback on Hannah and just kind of lift up some of those points.
That's great, thanks. And we have time for probably just one more question here. But speaking to the notion of flexibility, but being flexible in this time of COVID, and now community engagement is done pretty much exclusively on a virtual basis. So Tilly, I'm wondering if you can speak to what that's looked like. You talked about this a little bit in San Francisco, but how have you amended your processes in terms of actually engaging with people, reaching out to them, and then the policy of congestion pricing itself? You talked a little bit about increased traffic, since the pandemic started, dropped initially, but then now it's back up. What does flexibility in the policy of congestion pricing look like in San Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so there's two pieces of that question. Thank you, Brianna. The first one, as far as outreach, that is something that our board felt really strongly about, and two board members in particular expressed real concern about authentic outreach on a topic like this, or any major topic at this time. It's really going to, to the extent that it does rely on thorough outreach and public engagement, particularly those most impacted, we really are going to struggle, but we're going to do our best. And they encouraged us to go forward with that guidance to use, flyering and radio and television and texting. We do have pretty good cell phone penetration. Data plans is another thing. You might have a cell phone, but you may not have that data plan. So being at the groceries, using the churches, using the community-based organizations, and meeting people where they're at, like Rio mentioned, and then offering to do these, in-person, sort of Zoom in-person hosted co-creation sessions with CBOs. There is some capacity still, and to the extent that there is, and we can compensate the folks for that time, there still is a willingness and a desire to do that. So we're doing that as much as we can. Whoever it is that wishes to have one, we'll make it happen. In language, we've done several in language as well, and so whatever it takes, our team is really committed to trying to make it work. But it is tough. I'll just be honest about that. COVID congestion tracker is a resource. It's a map, interactive map on our website, and we put a blog post out on it recently, so folks can look it up. And this is just basically a snapshot of what the week by week picture of traffic congestion levels is by car and by bus. So whether you're a transit rider or a driver, you can look up your route and understand, the situation in your neighborhood.
Great. Yeah, I know there were a lot of specific questions about that tool, so I'm glad you touched on that. And just in general, a lot of specific questions addressed at each of you. So I encourage the folks, we're out of time now, unfortunately, but I encourage folks to reach out to the speakers or to Eno, and we can, field questions as appropriate. But just want to thank you all so much for joining us on this panel. Eno plans to stay engaged, certainly in the topic of equity and congestion pricing specifically, but congestion pricing also more broadly. Please join us this Thursday for a webinar about best practices for incorporating equity into performance-based processes. So that's at the Metropolitan Planning Organization level. You can register for that webinar on Eno's website, and you can also stay up to date on industry news by subscribing to Eno Transportation Weekly. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Take care.